Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can break my heart. I think many of us can relate to that experience of heartbreak. We've either been on the receiving end or on the giving end, or perhaps on both. Certainly, we've all been hurt by words that others have spoken, and if we're honest with ourselves, we've all also wounded others, even intimate others, with our own words. The theme of this month is vulnerability. And as Reverend Greg reminded us a few weeks ago, the word itself comes from a Latin root which means able to be wounded. We are vulnerable to the impact of language. Words can leave wounds, at times even more damaging and long-lasting than physical injuries. Given this vulnerability, how can we begin and to learn to speak to one another with sensitivity, honesty, courage, and humble curiosity? That's the question that I've been wrestling with. How do we practice what the Buddhists call right speech within the context of this congregation? I always like to say that a congregation is a conversation. Perhaps you've heard me say that. You'll hear it many more times. And a sermon is just one moment, a privileged moment to be sure, but just one moment taken out of that larger ongoing conversation. And it's that continuing communal conversation among many voices, your voices, that matters. A sermon is meant to feed back into that congregational conversation, to encourage it, to deepen it, to expand it, to provoke it, to nurture it. I'm saying that this fellowship is, in a sense, made up of nothing more than words. Yes, we have a building, but the substance, the essence of the fellowship community, spiritual community, is its conversation. And that's so we all construct worlds through speech, social worlds. As one of my teachers, the radical feminist theologian Mary Daly, said, reality hangs on the thin thread of conversation. What we talk about matters deeply, and how we talk matters even more. So I want to begin this sermon by acknowledging the privilege and the responsibility of preaching, my own power and my own vulnerability. And after I've shared a few reflections, I want to invite your thoughts and feelings in a time of congregational sharing. So yes, a congregation is a conversation. But what kind of conversation? That's the question. Different forms of speech are appropriate for different situations. Think of how you might talk, not just what you might talk about, but how you would talk on a blind date as compared to a courtroom trial or a classroom or a political campaign or a business meeting or a locker room or a worship service. Those are all different speech situations, each with different rules and expectations and assumptions. But perhaps there are some universal principles of right speech that cut across all of those boundaries. I'm going to have to get a new prescription here pretty soon. The 20th century German philosopher Jürgen Habermas was deeply, deeply troubled by the failure of public and political discourse and the destructive power of propaganda and hate speech during the Nazi era. He spent his entire career trying to understand how genuine human communication happens and how it breaks down, how it's distorted and disrupted by ideological and psychological and economic forces. He introduced the idea of what he called an ideal speech situation, an imaginary scenario in which communication is undistorted by any such influences. Now, the reason it's called an ideal speech situation is that it doesn't exist in the real world. All of our communication with one another is systemically distorted by the culture of capitalism, the histories of racism and sexism and so forth. All of these factors enter into and distort and direct our conversation in some ways and away from other ways of communicating. So Habermas was proposing a thought experiment, if you will. What if those distortions were somehow removed, magically removed? What would it be like if people could just communicate without those distortions? What and how would they say? The closest that Habermas could come to imagining such a community was a community of scientific researchers committed to truth. And he later had to revise that considerably, recognizing, of course, the distortions that do exist in actual research communities among scientists. But the thought experiment was his point. I remember my own high school physics teacher demonstrating that a feather and a stone contained within a long glass cylinder would fall at the same rate due to gravity once the air was pumped out of the tube, creating a vacuum. It was really quite a mind-blowing demonstration for a high school student. When I try to imagine Habermas's thought experiment by analogy, I wonder what it would be like if, for example, all the fear were pumped out of this room right now. All of the fear was removed. How would that affect the way I preach? In my ordination charge, I was told to preach the truth as I understood it without fear or favor. And I recognize that when I enter into this congregational conversation, I bring my own emotional history, my own emotional biases, and that affects what I say and how I say it. I bring not just fear, but sadness, anger, even joy. And it must be said that these emotions do not only distort. Don't misunderstand me. In fact, sometimes emotions reveal truths that cannot be accessed by sheer intellect alone. Both head and heart are needed in any true human community and communication. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, one of our great Unitarians, he said, the true preacher can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. So life is more than thought. The intellectual processing or interpretation acts upon a substance that's greater and deeper than intellect alone. It's emotional, it's heartfelt, it's our life. So what might I be afraid of as a preacher? Perhaps of being misunderstood, that in something I say misunderstood in a way that causes harm. The power of language to cause harm is very much a hot topic these days, if you haven't noticed. From so-called cancel culture and deplatforming on college campuses to inflammatory political rhetoric and hateful trolling on social media, along with a heightened awareness and sensitivity to the complexity of racial, sexual, gender, and religious identities. In all of this, many are anxious about what can and cannot be said without offending, without causing uh, not just offense, but actual harm to someone. We are witnessing and experiencing what some have called the weaponization of speech all across the political spectrum. At times, the argument to me seems to be about, as Humpty Dumpty said, which is to be master, rather than a genuine search for truth. So I'm motivated in part by the question of what are the limits of free speech? What is free speech from a spiritual perspective, not from a political or constitutional legal perspective, but from a spiritual perspective? The Buddhists call it right speech. The comedian Chris Rock addressed this aspect of the current culture wars head on in a recent Netflix special called Selective Outrage. I'm trying to do a show tonight, he began, without offending nobody. You never know who might get triggered. You say the wrong thing, gotta watch out. You know what people say, words hurt. And then he adds, with a knowing smirk, anybody who says words hurt has never been punched in the face. An obvious reference to the famous slap he received from Will Smith at the 2022 Academy Awards. Words hurt, the comedian concludes, when you write them on a brick. I get the joke. I get the punch line, so to speak. There's a real difference. There is a real difference between verbal and physical violence. And to deny that difference is to insult and discount those who have been the victims of actual bodily assault. On the other hand, anyone who says that words can't inflict real harm needs to read the statistics about teen depression and suicide, especially among young adolescent girls who feel bullied online. Nothing but words that hurt and harm. Now, comedians are in the business of pushing the boundaries and speaking uncomfortable truths. Preachers are too, I guess, in a different way. I think of my mentor's advice to preach so as to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I somewhat jokingly, but really quite seriously, refer to my Wednesday night class as stand-up theology for a reason. By the way, if I were a real comedian, it would be a flop. People aren't coming on Wednesday night for whatever reason. Not few faithful attendees, and I really appreciate that, but I may need to rethink that. So what kind of conversation are we in here, really, in this fellowship? Is it a discussion? Is it a debate? Is it an argument? Maybe even a nice knockdown argument like Humpty Dumpty likes. We discuss a lot of things. By the way, that word, and there's nothing wrong with discussion, I love discussion, but I always noticed that the word discussion actually comes from the same root as concussion. It's about two opposing ideas colliding with one another. Perhaps it's in our historical and institutional DNA to be argumentative. In fact, I have a slide here. I ask maybe Dale or Heather can put that up. The Unitarian Church was born out of theological debate and argument. There's a slide here coming up that shows the Transylvanian preacher and theologian Francis David. I saw this everywhere when I was visiting Transylvania, visiting the Unitarian churches there. This picture, this big picture, this size, was on the office wall of every single minister that I visited, and among American Unitarian ministers too. This is Francis David. He's pointing up, Az egy Isten in Hungarian. God is one. He was in, the man in the red robe on the left is the king, King Sigismund, and who had convened this debate among rival theological schools. And at that time, debates were like jousting tournaments. They were hugely popular. People bought tickets, ate popcorn, sat and cheered. I mean, I'm being a little bit silly, but this was the thing to do, to come and listen to the theologians debate the fine points of Trinitarian theology. He won this debate, and Sigismund said he's going to become a Unitarian and would make the religion legitimate in his kingdom. But the point is, you can take this down, by the way. You can take the slide down. It's our identity in some cases, in this case, was born out of an argument, an argumentative debate, the object of which was to win points. And that goes very deep in our historical DNA. It's true of American Unitarianism too, and Universalism on the frontier, always arguing. And I wonder sometimes what our history would be like if we placed as much emphasis on what I'm going to later call dialogue rather than debate, or beyond debate. But don't get me wrong, there are times when discussion, vigorous debate, and even argument are necessary in a religious community. And I want to be part of a passionate conversation, not a conversation that avoids the difficult topics. But beyond these forms of argumentative speech, there is something called dialogue. And the word dialogue itself refers to meaning. It's a flowing through conversation, meaning flowing through conversation. It's like the participants in the dialogue are like the banks of a river, holding the flowing, meaningful, the emergence of meaning between them as they engage in conversation. William Isaacs, the founder of the Dialogue Project at MIT, distinguishes between dialogue and negotiation. He says the aim of negotiation is to reach agreement among parties who differ. The intention of dialogue is to reach new understanding, and in doing so, to form a totally new basis from which to think and act. So dialogue is breaking new ground. It's a new kind of conversation, and it requires certain kinds of skills, and those need to be learned, and at times that can be awkward and feel awkward when we're learning. And so oftentimes we just stick to what we know, which is debate and argument and discussion. A dialogue, another way of thinking about it, it's a conversation that has a center but not sides. You don't choose sides in a dialogue. Together we relate to a center. Maybe a problem, it may be an idea, a situation, but we don't take sides. We focus together on the center. So the Buddhist concept of right speech is one of the tools that can be used in genuine dialogue. The Buddha himself described right speech as abstaining from lying, from divisive speech, from abusive speech, and from idle chatter. That's again, a mindfulness around how we use language. The first rule of right speech, however, unstated here, but the first rule of right speech is to listen. It sounds strange, perhaps, but the first rule of right speech is to listen carefully. We tend not to listen. So one of my friends says, we don't listen, we reload. While the other person is speaking, we're loading up our next ammunition for our next assault. True listening, true right speech begins with genuine, deep listening. I spoke. I'm want to leave time for some dialogue here, so from conversation. So I just want to just briefly go back to the children's story about the pillows and the pillowcase. It comes that actually the origin of that story is in the Jewish tradition. I tried to adapt it for the children, but in the Jewish tradition, there's this thing called lashon hara, which means the evil tongue. Lashon is the tongue, hara, the evil tongue. And there are all kinds of ethical commandments trying to contain and constrain lashon hara, to prevent people from gossiping, from spreading rumors and so on. The Talmud speaks of the tongue being behind not one but two locked gates, the lips and the teeth. The tongue is so, the potential of the tongue to do harm is such that it needs to be locked behind two layers of boundaries. So that's another way of just thinking about how it is that we use that language, our language. And as I said, the letter of James that I read from, although it's in the New Testament, it stands firmly within that Jewish tradition of awareness of the powerful potential of the tongue to cause harm. But of course, the tongue also is the capability to bless and to heal. And hopefully that's we can talk about that as well. I'm gonna leave it here for now. There's more I could say, but I want to practice myself right speech and listen carefully to your thoughts and feelings on this question of how Diane always tells me about the MIT, the most important thing. It's what I want you to hear is that right speech, whether in the Buddhist sense or the Jewish or Christian or any secular sense, right speech in religious community is a practice. It's a spiritual practice. It's not a management technique. It's a spiritual practice that we share together in order to hold together the community, the fellowship in all its potential. So I'm going to leave it there.